welcome. So first of all, I really hope that you're all keeping safe and warm and that your girls are doing well this winter. And so welcome to a glimpse into a year in my beekeeping life and some of the things that I think about and do at this time of year. I'm really hoping that I can make the next 45 minutes or so interesting and not only informative, but also entertaining. So during the presentation, I'll walk through a typical beekeeping year with a little focus and hopefully learning on the following items. So goals, environmental factors, biology. I'll be spending a large part of our time on bee biology and also focusing on Varroa, and hopefully provide you also some practical tips sprinkled in along the way for good measure. So just to kind of break the ice a bit, here's a picture of my apiary. And as Lynn said, I've got a few hives. They're actually in my backyard, and I live in a suburb of Montreal, and I'm surrounded by a park and lots of diverse forage. And so, you know, here's a couple of one super on each hive, and sometimes there's a couple more, and sometimes I'm down to a single brood box, which is how I go into winter and come out in early spring. And so here's what the hives look like today. And in fact, I took this picture last Sunday, and of course, to the untrained eye, it's just a big pile of snow, but we beekeepers know that there's a lot going on inside those hives, even now, under that snow, but more on that later. So in this time of COVID and harbor in place or stay-at-home orders, and we have actually a curfew in our province. A lot of us who are working virtually. I just really need to get out of the house, and I like to have some fun and be a kid again. So this is how I occupy my time when I'm not otherwise in the house or thinking of the upcoming beekeeping season. So I really hope that in our time together, I can help inspire you with some new knowledge about your bees and things to think about to help you around the bee yard. So this is a great chart from the Black Bees of Killowen and Stonyhurst website in England. It's really apropos for our presentation today, as it shows at a glance some of the tasks you'll be planning each season for your bees. Now, I've taken the liberty of adding some additional information here for today's presentation. First of all, the red line on the bottom roughly represents the Varroa mite population buildup, decline, and approximate timing of when peak mite loads will be stressing your bees. I'll be talking about what you can do to minimize this really nasty pest when I get into bee biology. So let's do a season overview of the major things going on in your hives and some of the management practices and considerations for each month. So really looking at the seasons and what's happening in the hive with a focus really on your bees and Varroa mites, sorry. So in the spring, grab my pointer. So in the spring, in this section, we're likely feeding our hives in early spring 1-to-1 sugar syrup and maybe some pollen. We've got a real busy mama bee laying, mama queen bee laying thousands of eggs. The nurse bees are tending to the brood, and foragers are starting to bring in the season's first nectar and pollen to feed the growing family. Drones are eagerly assembling in drone congregation areas in hopes of mating with virgin queens to pass on their DNA. And so, you know, we're looking at doing our first examination, maybe mark a new queen. And don't forget, we'll be monitoring for Varroa mites and treating it if necessary. In the summertime, as we can see with the brown line, our bee population is really exploding, as is our brood is at the highest point, and our mites are starting to creep up. So foragers abound at this time. Mites are building, queen excluders and honey supers are going on and filling up. You may even be doing an extraction of spring or varietal honey. It's a busy and awesome time for all of us. And again, don't forget to be monitoring for your Varroa mites and keeping them under control as necessary. In the fall or in the autumn, your queen is slowing down laying. And now those eggs that she's laying will become your winter bees that are so critical to pass through the winter. And they've got to be healthy with their fat bodies larger than summer bees. And it's those fat bodies that in order to develop them well, they need ample protein and nectar to develop. So you may be feeding. You might also be continuing to treat for mites because it's important to get the loads down before winter. And then of course there's that little activity of reaping the labors of the fruits of our labors, and keeps us up off until the wee hours. And that of course would be honey extraction that we're doing in late summer and fall. And then of course in the winter, after our final mite monitoring and treatment is necessary and we've winterized our hives, it's time to take a breather and enjoy our honey and other fruits of our labors. And of course, now it's also the time to clean equipment and think of goals for the coming season and reflect on how we can apply what we've learned this past year to hopefully have a more successful season the year ahead. So on that note, before I get into bee biology and behavior, I'd like to spend a few minutes on looking at planning. So my husband, he's a naval war veteran from the Canadian Navy, and he always says that a plan is only a basis for a departure. That, of course, means that it won't be set in stone, that we will need to evaluate and make adjustments along the way. Point in case, think of how COVID probably derailed a lot of what you were planning to do in the past year, and with whom and when and how. And my career in human resources has also taught me that if you set a goal and write it down and build a plan to achieve it, you're way more likely to actually achieve that goal. So let's take a look at some considerations as you plan your 2021 beekeeping year. So whether you're a hobbyist, a sideliner, or beekeeping is your main income, you want to plan ahead for this season and ask yourself, what are the specific beekeeping goals for 2021? Do you want to maximize honey production? If so, what might you be doing differently in the apiary to do that? Do you want to expand your number of colonies? How? Through splits, purchasing nukes like Wayne, or packages, purchasing bees? Where do you want to locate your colonies? Do you want to get into pollination services? Do you need to update and improve your contracts with your clients if you're already doing that? Are you new to that business? If so, make sure you do have a contract. And you know what? Wayne mentioned that you'll be having a mentoring program, and that's an awesome way when you're embarking on anything new in beekeeping, certainly is to connect with a mentor. Will you be doing queen rearing? Is that the first time, or will you be expanding an offering that you already have? And skill-wise, do you want to improve your integrated pest management skills in order to deal with that dreaded Varroa? Where are you going to learn that and how? And again, do you have a mentor that you can trust? So environmental factors. So before we look at bee biology and cycles during the season, let's look at some environmental factors. And so what I mean by environmental factors is basically everything around beekeeping activities that has an impact on how and what we do with our bees and in the bee yard. So for example, we talk about equipment and supplies. Now's a great time to take inventory of our equipment. Is it sufficient to meet our goals? Do I need to acquire new woodenware? Maybe an extractor. It's great if you can borrow one from the club. Do you have to reserve it ahead of time? What about supplies such as mite treatments, nukes, packages, queens? You'll want to be ordering those now if that's not already done. How will COVID affect your usual suppliers? How has it affected them? Hopefully they're all still in business. Maybe their pickup or delivery timelines may be longer than usual because of various measures that are taken. There could be, there could be interstate restrictions on treatments and, I lost my place. There could be, interstate travel restrictions that may play a part. So get informed now so that you're not going to be left out in the cold, so to speak. What about budget? What are the costs associated with the goals and the budget that you're willing to spend? Is it an investment that's worth the return that you're planning, or do you need to rework your goals? And finally, research. Weather predictions for the coming year we have information on weather predictions for the coming year, and you'll see that in a moment, and that can help us plan ahead. What about blooms that are blooming in your area? Find the blooming times for native flowers and crops in your area, because that's when the pollen and nectar is going to be coming in. And here's a couple of resources. And by the way, all the resources I list, I'll list it again at the end of the presentation, and I can copy them in the chat so you can have them afterwards. So there's loads of online resources such as planting calendars, frost dates, blooming times for native flowers and crops in your area that you can look at. So coming to weather, this is a real busy slide. So for just a second, don't try to read it. We can always plan a general beekeeping calendar based on annual bee and beekeeping cycle, as we saw with the first graph. But what outside factors affect our bees? Naturally, temperature and sunlight and precipitation. And these all have an effect on bee activity and consequently the chores that we have in the apiary. Again, a plan, or in this case, a forecast, is only a basis for a departure. So other than the Farmer's Almanac, what tools are out there for us to use to gain some insight on what the long-term weather might be? So this screenshot is a sample of some data that's available from the US National Weather Service. And well, okay, so that's all very nice, but so what? So now we can see from this graph here, from this graph here, that basically in spring, March, April, and May of 2021, the outlook shows that it might be a little bit warmer than usual this spring. So, and it also lets us know for the same time period that we're likely to have an average level of precipitation. And this is for our area, our being New York State and Quebec, Eastern North America. So it probably won't be wetter or drier than usual. Now, warmer weather will bring our beehives to life a little earlier in the season. So that means, and knowing that now is good, because that means we should plan to start actively tending our bees maybe a week or two sooner. Hopefully, we can hope. We'll probably have to feed earlier as well. So make sure you have those supplies. And also be prepared to check mite loads earlier, and treat if you have over 2 mites per 100 bees. So take stock of your equipment now, clean it up, replace, repair, check your feeders, check your stock of feed and Varroa treatments. Are your tools clean and in good order? What will you have to buy and when in order to be ready in case the season starts early? And like I said, we can only hope. You probably have to order newts and queens now, as I said earlier, if you haven't already done so. Of course, this review of long-range forecasts is cyclical. Check the information monthly and modify your plan accordingly, and it should reduce a bit of the stress you have later on in the year when it gets really busy. Another tip I'd like to offer is that daily weather reports nowadays often include pollen counts. And this, of course, is mainly for allergy sufferers. However, I've started paying attention to them to know what's blooming in my area, which can help me understand what kind of protein nutrition my bees are bringing in. Another example of information that's available and helpful is this resource from the Office of the New York State Controller to help inform your decisions for the coming year. So let's say you wish to expand your apiaries across the state. You'll want to understand land use. So take Columbia County. Of course, you know where you live. So in the case of Columbia County, a quarter of the land is used for agriculture. Now, we do know from numerous scientific studies that 95% of corn and soy are treated with, which are major crops of the state of New York, are treated with neonicotinoid pesticides, which has adverse effects for bees. So if you're planning to expand or move your apiary, make sure to get to know the farmers in the locality and ask about their pesticide applications and timings. It's an opportunity to share your knowledge as a beekeeper to help your local farmers and also to help your bees. So in the next section, I'll touch on things that we know about bee biology that can make us even better stewards of these amazing and important creatures. So looking through a microscope, here we see a photo of a honeybee's head front view showing antenna and eyes. And here we see the two, I'll just get my pointer again. Here we see the two large compound eyes of a honeybee. And right up here on the top are the 1, 2, 3 ocelli, or the small simple eyes. They're very, very tiny and really hard to see in real life, but those are the 3 simple eyes of a bee. So a total of five eyes. So they're really different what these 2 different types of eyes can do. So those big compound bee eyes perceive color, but only greens, blues, ultraviolets, and polarized light, which is really important for orientation by the sun, which they can do even if the sun is behind the clouds. Their eyesight makes some flowers seem brighter to them, and they can actually see patterns that we can't. The compound eyes have thousands of pixels, like the pixels on your television or your computer screen, but they're really, really low resolution. Now, the ocelli, on the other hand, or simple eyes, detect light intensity, so not an image per se. So anything beyond 2 yards for a bee is absolutely blurry. The ocelli also regulate behavioral and hormonal changes from day to night, actually telling the bee what to do. So eyes are important for learning and memory, and when they get really close to the hives, so under 2 yards, things come into really sharp focus and they find their nest entrance. And they learn where that nest entrance is, and that's why they're able to come back day after day. They also learn where flowers and good forage sites are by visual cues, as well as other cues that I'll come to in a moment. So regarding the fact that bees see really sharp with only within like 2 yards or 2 meters, that's why we're told if we want to move a hive, either move it over 2 miles away in one, overnight or during the winter, because bees will remember large landmarks due to their eyesight in order to orient themselves home. And they'll remember, within a 2-mile radius, pretty much all the large, landmarks, trees, houses, sheds, that sort of thing. If you're not moving your hive that far, if you just want to move it across the apiary, then you're advised to move it only a couple of feet increments at a time over several days in order to give them time to learn and remember the new hive location. Because again, they'll come back to their old hive location, see that it's not exactly where it was, but if it's within a couple of yards, they'll be able to find it. So also, if you can, it's really good practice to space hives as far apart as you can and paint them different colors. Put them by landmarks like trees, a shed or house, or an others in an open field. And that's because you want to reduce drift, meaning bees that end up going into the wrong house because they can end up, carrying diseases and doing other things that are not helpful for the beekeeper. Now, regarding movement, even if bees don't see clearly beyond 2 yards, they do detect movement super fast in 3/100ths of a second, much faster than we can. So moving in an agitated way or quickly around your apiary could arouse defensive behavior. And that's why it's important to work slowly and calmly, because you probably know already you'll never outrun an angry bee. Now, did you know that bees can perceive gravity? So similar to the tiny hairs in our inner ears that help us know which way is up, bees have pads of hairs in their neck between the head and the thorax, which help them perceive gravity. And bees will use the sense of gravity to orient their waggle dances on the comb, which tells their nestmates where good food is. An uneven hive will interfere with comb building. And why is that? Because bees will build brace or burr comb across frames, and it'll be a nuisance. If the frames are level and vertical, you're not likely to have that issue. So if you have brace comb between frames, check if your hives are level. It could also be because you have maybe too much space between your frames. So here's a tip. I like to use a level when installing a new hive or adjusting one that has brace comb. Now, what is sound? Sound is vibrations traveling through something like air, water, a wall that we can hear through tiny bones and hairs in our own ears. Well, bees don't have ears like how we think of ears, but parts of a honeybee body does hear sound, and that's with their antenna and their legs. So the antenna perceive or hear airborne vibrations, such as bees doing the waggle dance within the hive. And organs in their legs perceive or hear substrate vibrations like comb vibrations. So when inspecting your hives, pry frames and move them gently. Pry and move them gently. You've probably heard that. Again, to keep your bees calm. If you've ever dropped tools on your hives or bumped them, you already know that they don't like it. So now you know a little bit more as to why. Now, sense of smell, the olfaction, is the bee's absolutely most important sense. And it is critical to finding the best food sources, to communicate through the pheromones that brood, bees, and the queen and the drone all exude different types of pheromones to tell each other things, to control actions, and even regulate hormones with other nestmates. And they use their sense of smell to discriminate, to recognize their own nestmates and to discriminate against non-nestmates. So if ever you have a bee coming, like trying to rob, if there's a guard bee at the entrance, that bee will smell the infiltrator and likely battle it and make sure it doesn't get in. So hundreds of tiny olfactory receptors are on the bee's antenna. So here is, hang on, my laser. So of course here is a diagram, and here's the bee's antennae. Again, it's a face forward diagram of the bee's heads. And those tiny receptors on the antenna bind to different odor molecules that are in the air. And they can even decipher from which direction smell is coming from, depending on if it's the left or the right antenna that's sensing more strongly. So they'll know in what direction to fly to zone in on a flower. And they use all this input to learn and remember those smells. And so here's a tip. Attack pheromone, which is released when a bee will sting you, smells like bananas. There are pherols in the attack pheromone. We call it attack pheromone because when a bee stings you and pheromones are released, it advises the nestmates that there's some sort of a threat to the hive and come and help and keep stinging. So because pherols in the bee sting pheromone, or the attack pheromone, are similar and in fact the same as some of the pherols in bananas, you probably don't want to be bringing bananas to the apiary with your lunch. So, and be eating them. So bees with their super sensitive olfactory organs will find you if you're eating a banana. I want to touch on thermoregulation. So thermoregulation, or really controlling temperature, is a fascinating aspect of bee biology and is critical for colony survival. So individual bees work independently, fanning hives at the entrance and bearding in the summer in order to cool the hive, and clustering in the winter. So unlike most insects, bees can generate heat by vibrating their flight muscles to create heat during flight, if it's a cooler day, and when inside their nest. And of course, they need to keep their nest between around 95 Fahrenheit or 35 Celsius for healthy brood development. The winter cluster is the most notable activity of thermoregulatory behavior. So below 57 degrees Fahrenheit or about 21 C, a cluster begins to form. The colder it is, the tighter that cluster gets. And within that cluster, they're vibrating those flight muscles, kind of like when we shiver. It's our body's attempt to warm up. Same thing with bees. The outer bees of that cluster provide insulation to the cluster, whereas the inner bees tend to take care of any brood, eat honey, and they'll switch places over hours or days with the outer bees in order to ensure there's a rotation and everyone gets a chance to be in the warm interior. And of course, at the center of that cluster is where the queen is. If there's a break in the cold, they'll come out to do a cleansing flight, defecating in the snow and leaving orange or brown streaks. And during time that the bees are in cluster, of course, foraging and water collection ceases in that when they're in cluster. Thermoregulation is absolutely crucial for brood to develop properly. You've heard that you should resist opening a colony in winter to check on it, and you can actually kill your colony, by opening it up in the winter, because you can chill the brood. And so just a few degrees variation can make the brood actually unviable. So that's also why we like to inspect on warm, sunny days and not leave brood frames outside the hive during our inspections. Want to tell you something about heater bees. Heater bees are noticeably hotter, and they will actually press their bodies against cat brood, much like a chicken incubates her egg. She'll also go into adjacent cells to a brood cell to heat the brood cell from the side. And bees will beard on the outside of the hive to cool the inside of their nest on a hot summer day or evening. Finally, thermoregulation is a defense. They use it as a defense against predators such as wasps. If a wasp enters the hive, the bees will actually ball the wasp and vibrating until they literally cook the wasp, because bees can tolerate about a degree and a half higher temperature than the wasp can. So it's a pretty neat skill that they have. So let's look at queen cups. Queen cups, which you've probably seen lots of them of different sorts in your hive. So just quickly, they tend to be queen cups themselves, like this one here without a egg in it, tend to be towards the bottom of the frame facing downward. You'll see more queen cups in the spring in preparation for swarming. And a queen cup with an egg in it, however, is then called a queen cell. So depending on where it is on the comb, it could be, that swarm cell, it could be a supersedure cell or an emergency cell. So supersedure cell happens when the queen is still alive in the hive, but the colony wants to supersede her because maybe she's too old and not laying well anymore. Maybe she's injured. A supersedure cell is usually found around the center of the face of the comb, and the current queen will actually lay an egg in it And that can happen any time of the year. As far as emergency cells, if the colony suddenly finds itself without a queen, maybe, hopefully not, but maybe you accidentally killed it during an inspection, or some other reason killed her, or she didn't come back from a mating flight because she died. And an emergency cell is found anywhere that there's worker larvae. So there's already an egg that's got to be under 3 days old that the previous queen has laid in a cell. And in other words, the colony will then choose to build a queen cell around the egg that's already deposited by the missing queen. And again, that can happen at any time of the year, and you'll find that kind of cell anywhere there is, as I said, brood eggs. And finally, the swarm cell, which we're probably the most familiar, is again usually on the bottom, and other factors such as if you have a honey-bound hive, meaning they just don't have enough room to store more nectar, if the population is too strong, and if there's nice warm weather coming up, and especially spring and early summer, that's likely when you're going to find much more swarm cells in your hives. So the queen will lay an egg in a queen cup, and that will become a queen cell or a swarm cell. Now, with permission of Cornell University, this particular chart comes from the Master Beekeeping program at Cornell University Dice Lab. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the castes of bees and development times of the honeybee and the Varroa destructor, because it's really something that's, I think, pretty important. So all castes of bees, queen, worker, and drone, begin life as an egg. And so the egg, for each case, it's an egg for the first 3 days. And then after 3 days, the egg hatches and becomes a larvae and remains in the larval state for the next 6 days, up to 9 days. Then the brood cell gets capped and the larvae pupates and eventually emerges as an adult bee, and that would be designated by the brown box at the end of the line. So in this graph, I'm only focusing on the development timelines of each of the castes, not what they're fed or any other factors. And I'd like to compare that with the development timelines of the Varroa destructor. So just a little refresher. As you know, the queen emerges the soonest, spending only 1 week in the pupal stage. A worker bee spends 12 days under the brood cap, and a drone spends a full 2 weeks sealed under the cap, emerging on day 24. Now, a mature female mite will crawl into a brood cell around this time, containing a larvae shortly before it's capped, within a day or two of being capped. So there's this female mite that crawls into the cell. She's called a foundress, and she will begin laying her eggs in that cell about 1 every 30 hours. So what you've got in the little blue boxes is, so let's say the first day she'll lay an egg. You'll know that you'll find more mites in drone cells. And why is that? In fact, you're likely to find 9 times more mites in drone cells than in worker cells, even though their developmental time is only 3 days longer. And that's likely because the longer development time, which gives the foundress time to lay more eggs, resulting in more mites that will eventually emerge with the adult drone. And so as you can see, every 30 hours or so, this blue section illustrates how she's laying another egg and another egg and another egg, and so on and so on and so on in that drone cell. So in fact, twice as many mites will emerge from a drone cell than from a worker cell. Now, thankfully, not all mite eggs that are laid will emerge mature. The others will die once the bee emerges, because they just won't all be mature by the time the bee emerges. Now, as I mentioned, it takes only 6 days for a mite to go from egg to maturity, when it will emerge and attach itself to an adult bee, becoming a phoretic bee, biting her, transmitting diseases, and weakening her. So it's pretty obvious that left unchecked, you can see it won't take long and your colony can be hopelessly overrun with mites. And that's why it's so important to monitor your mite levels and take action in a timely manner. And that's all year round. So this basic information on this slide is something every beekeeper should know really by heart, as it will help you make informed decisions on how to best control mites in your colonies. So here is a great tool from the Cornell University Master Beekeeping Program, which I'm showing to you here. And it's a calendar. And this is a calendar, a sample calendar on something that you can actually do yourself, which is going to be a great tool to help you along in the season when things get busy. You can make your own calendar using, a paper wall calendar with boxes on it and writing onto it, or take a free online fillable version. So this sample calendar from Cornell is for a hobbyist beekeeper. However, you can easily scale it up for a larger operation. Now, the three main pieces of information you want on your calendar are: what's your integrated pest management approach? So just list, do you want to use cultural methods, chemicals, synthetic, natural, etc. You want to include dates on the calendar for all your planned activities. And you want to include information on testing, results of testing, treatments, chemicals, etc. So more specifically, coming back to your IPM philosophy, what combination of methods do you want to use? Natural chemicals, cultural methods, genetic methods, synthetic chemicals. So now, using what you know about cyclical Varroa loads and bees and brood population buildup from that first chart with the graph and what I just showed you, as well as the developmental times for bee castes and Varroa mites, you can put milestones on your calendar for monitoring mites. That's why we recommend to test monthly from April through November, weather permitting. Then, depending on the results, you'll treat according to manufacturer's directions and put dates on when to remove your treatments, so you don't forget. If you use cultural methods like drone comb, you know from drone reproductive timing that you should use them from spring until early August in our area. And I like to use also a screened bottom board all year round, which allows groomed mites to fall off and out of the nest. You also know from queen biology that you don't want to requeen too late in the season, especially if she's a virgin queen, as there won't be enough drones around later in the season to mate with her, or time for her to build up the population with winter bees that have larger fat bodies to survive the winter. Next, record your comments on what type of monitoring, testing, Varroa testing did you do? Number of mites per 100 bees, what chemicals you used, and what was the efficacy of those methods? And here's a tip that I didn't do in the first year and I was lost in the second year, but keep good records in any way that makes sense to you, because you just can't remember all that information. To borrow an acronym from my days as a glider pilot, SOAR. So SOAR stands for situation, options, actions, and review. So remember, a plan is a point of departure, adjusted as necessary. So, and SOAR, like the bees. I can say that my career in human resources has taught me that if you set a goal and put a date on it and write that goal and date on a calendar with a reminder, you're way more likely to actually do it rather than just say, you know what, this year I'll try to monitor for mites regularly. So wrapping up what we've just looked at and coming back to our original chart, we're in winter. We're at the beginning of, we're just over here. Not too much is happening in the colony other than they're keeping warm. So plan now, write your goals down, and make some plans. Look beyond the bee yard for information. Check in with suppliers. Find a mentor. Consider your equipment and supplies levels. What does the long-term weather look like? Do your suppliers have unique scenarios this year because of COVID? What are the economics? What kind of budgeting do you need to do? And of course, understanding bee biology can really make you a better beekeeper by knowing why you're doing something and not just doing something because somebody you trust told you. And that way you'll be able to discuss with peers and think critically about decisions you're making, and hopefully make better decisions as you go along and learn from each other. And of course, keep good records in any fashion that works for you. So again, goals, equipment, supplies, research. So here are some resources, and I can copy that into the chat in a moment, and that way you can have some access to some really good sites and some of the information that I referred to in my presentation. And so I just want to say thank you so much for your interest, and please, if you think of anything after tonight, please feel free to reach out to me via email with any questions or comments or suggestions that you have, because I'm really open to doing better and more appropriate presentations for the future to help beekeepers. And check out my YouTube channel.